Hello, it's Anna Hill here with the Farming Today podcast. 20 tonnes of illegal meat imports have been seized this September alone at Dover.
We've got to the point now where nothing really surprises the team. So every part of an animal we are seeing across the full spectrum, whether it's pig, beef, chicken, eggs, cheese, etc.
The head of Port Health at Dover says illegal meat imports are escalating. We'll hear more from her later in the programme. First today, it was a stark image, a pile of discarded wellies outside the Senedd in Wales, when farmers protested at the proposed sustainable farming scheme, which they said would cut livestock numbers and jobs. The SFS has since been reshaped, and a new economic assessment has just been published, showing its potential impact has been reduced. But NFU Cymru said the latest analysis still made for extremely concerning reading. I asked BBC Wales Environment Correspondent Steffan to remind us of the background.
The sustainable farming scheme is the Welsh Government's plan for delivering farm subsidies post-Brexit. It's set to be introduced next year, a decade on, of course, since that vote to leave the EU. And the idea here is to reward greener farming practices. And it's been a difficult road for the Welsh Government in getting here, including those big protests you mentioned back at the start of last year. They were triggered in part by the publication of an economic impact assessment, which suggested the new funding in promoting a more mixed farming approach, more wildlife habitat and tree planting and so on, could lead to a 10.8% reduction in livestock on Welsh farms and an 11.4% reduction in labour, in hours worked on farms. And unions translated this into potential job cuts, with farmers placing 5,500 empty wellies on the steps of the Senedd in protest. The document itself had cautioned against reading too much into the figures, saying there were lots of caveats. They didn't necessarily equate to an actual reduction in jobs. There was likely to be an increase in non-agricultural tasks on farms, for instance, in things like woodland management. But nevertheless, it led to those big concerns. The scheme was paused. Round-table groups were set up for farming leaders, environmentalists, ministers to work through the areas of disagreement. And a revised scheme was then published back in July, and it included things like scrapping one of the most controversial elements, which was a 10% tree cover rule for farms.
And so now the updated economic impact assessment is out. What does it show?
So it's still predicting reductions in livestock, but that's been halved to around 5%. In terms of the reduction in labour, that's down 2 to 4%. But the documents and the government as well, in explaining all of this, has been emphasising that these are likely to be overestimates, a worst-case scenario, and pointing out that the analysis only takes into account what's known as the initial universal layer of the new funding scheme. There'll be more money, more grants available in another optional layer where farmers can volunteer to do more ambitious environmental work, and in a collaborative layer which will reward farms working together on landscape scale changes. And the overall business case published by the Welsh Government concludes that the SFS, the Sustainable Farming Scheme, is expected to deliver better societal outcomes and better value for money than the current subsidies.
And the reaction then to this new assessment?
So, while the new figures are an improvement, they represent less bad news, if you like, according to NFU Cymru, who say they're still extremely concerned by those percentages. They say the basic shape of the SFS is right, but the Welsh Government needs to get back round the table with them to finesse it now, they say. Environment groups point out that the farming industry was losing jobs under the current system, with a reduction in the total labour force in Wales of around 8,000 people between 2011 and 2021. WWF Cymru has said it fears the SFS has been watered down since those farmer protests. It doesn't live up to its name and won't deliver sustainable farming, they say. And they want the government to put much more cash now into those optional and collaborative layers that I mentioned, making sure most of the money is going towards action on nature loss, on climate change, which they say will make farm businesses more resilient. The Welsh Government, finally, very much making the point that no two farms are alike, and urging them all to look in depth at what the scheme means for their own individual businesses, rather than focusing too much on the figures in these reports.
BBC Wales Environment Correspondent Steffan. Now, traditionally, this was the time of year for farm workers' wages to be set, although many businesses have shifted to the beginning of April in line with the financial year. This is still a moment when thoughts turn to pay. And there's a warning that farmers will be facing further cost pressures to attract and keep staff while other sectors increase pay. Nick Watson from land consultant Stratton Parker told me the effects of inflation couldn't be ignored.
There's the elephant in the room that everybody is faced with, whether you're an employer or an employee, and that is inflation, which is currently running at about 3.8%. And then if you add into that the cost of housing, it goes up to 4.2%. And that's really been the driving force behind the wage increases we've seen across most sectors.
Some people might say, well, there are added costs. The cost of living is going up, so wage increases are viable. They have to be put into the mix, don't they?
I think that's a fair comment, Anna. We're all facing increasing costs in our daily lives, and that inevitably has to be balanced out by income at some stage, although there's always a lag.
It sounds rather similar to the pressures faced by many small and medium-sized enterprises. Are there factors which will make it feel particularly tough for farm businesses, though?
Absolutely, and we all know this year's been yet another exceptional year of weather, this time dry rather than wet, and that's had a knock-on implications on yield. We're producing less, and we're not seeing the price increases that would normally be associated with a lack of supply because we're operating in a world market.
That is the case in the arable sector, but, for livestock farmers, actually, prices they're getting for their meat is actually quite good.
Livestock and dairy are having a reasonable time at the moment. There's no question about it.
So it's a balance, isn't it, that a farm business owner needs to make between what's coming in and what they're paying out. Would that mean then thinking of actually not employing so many people or cutting hours?
Each farm's different, we know that. But the trend is one of increasing costs of production driven by the underlying rate of inflation. And as a result, it really is a time where we all need to be looking very closely at our farming businesses and be operating as efficiently as we possibly can, and looking towards the old diversification word that comes out at times like this. But it's important.
Would you say labour, the cost of labour, is a decider in a farm business, or is it just one part of the equation?
Oh, it's one part of the equation. There's no two ways about that. But one has to look at it also from the employee's point of view, particularly for those that are less skilled. They have choices. And so as an employer on a farm, one has to be alive to that.
Nick Watson from Stratton Parker. 20 tonnes of illegal meat and animal products have been intercepted at Dover in September alone, according to the head of Port Health and Public Protection there. Lucy Manzano told us that the amount of illegal meat found in vans and even coaches is escalating. Last month, MPs on the Commons Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Committee warned that the problem was at crisis level and increased the risk of diseases like foot and mouth or African swine fever entering the UK. Dover Port Health Authority is part of the District Council and it works alongside the Border Force. Lucy Manzano described what her staff are seeing.
Unfortunately, the figures continue to escalate. In 2022, we seized 1.3 tonnes in September. If we jump forward to 2025, we have seized a total of 20.5 tonnes. So we are talking about a 15-fold increase. And what we are seeing pretty much on a month-by-month basis is a sort of 300% surge in products that we are removing. And of course, that's only the products we are removing with very limited staff, and indeed 30% less staff than we had in 2022.
Just describe what you're encountering when you search vehicles.
We've got to the point now where nothing really surprises the team. So every part of an animal we are seeing across a full spectrum, whether it's pig, beef, chicken, eggs, cheese, etc. We're getting the full spectrum and every cut, slice and presentation you could possibly imagine. And these products are travelling for several days, sometimes up to a week, within vehicles that do not have, appropriate refrigeration or hygiene conditions, etc.
Is this frozen or fresh?
It may well have started off frozen by the time it arrives with us. It is at ambient temperatures, which obviously presents a much wider public health risk from a sort of food safety point of view. And the meat is often displays signs of poor welfare, will be visually unclean and dirty. And it comes in a range of packaging, from quite high-end packaging, without labelling, without mark, or in reused plastic boxes, second-hand boxes, foil, paper. It really is an array of presentations. There is no real consistency. The only real consistency that we're seeing is that these volumes are significantly rising, and they are not what you would interpret as a personal import.
Are they in amongst other consignments, or are they actually just blatantly in the back of a van?
They are largely in plain sight. We have a few that will come in vans, and there will be other objects stacked on top of them, furniture, non-food related items, in an attempt to cover them, or coach, which is another common mode of transport that's used to bring in large quantities of illegal products of animal origin.
What sort of products are we seeing? Is this meat that's undercutting legitimate products here, or products that aren't usually available here?
It's meat that is undercutting products. This meat is extremely cheap in the places where it's coming from, many of which are countries that are prohibited from actually exporting the meat outside of their own country. So it is very cheap to purchase. And it looks, outside of the packaging, largely exactly the same as any other piece of meat that you would choose to purchase. So, in market stalls, etc., if this was laid out the same as any other, it would be impossible to determine where it had come from.
Where has this come from, and is there a pattern?
We're seeing a mix, actually, of it coming from both within European countries and countries that we would refer to as rest of world. We are commonly seeing products coming from countries such as Romania, Moldova, Ukraine, Poland.
DEFRA says, it's given 3.1 million funding for the Port Health Authority.
This financial year, we haven't received any payments from DEFRA. Our funding has been cut, and we have less staff now than we did in 2022. We are using our own intelligence to try and move with the trade. We only have capacity to cover 20%. And so from some hard work from the Dover Port Health team, we are putting great effort into moving our work round to catch them when they are most likely to be coming in.
Lucy Manzano. DEFRA told us in a statement, this government has significantly increased seizures of illegal meat, restricted the import of dangerous animal products, and is investing over £1 billion in a new national biosecurity centre to protect our food supply, farmers and economy. We have steadily tightened the rules, they said, for importing meat into Great Britain, and will continue to work closely with port operators, industry, trade partners and border force to shield our livestock crops and food chain from dangerous diseases. That's all from us. I'm Anna Hill. The producer was Sarah Swadling. Farming Today is a BBC Audio Bristol production.